welcome to all of you on this wonderful spring day. And it comes in via the window, so you're not completely deprived as you're looking at the slides. Thank you for joining us for our panel with Jock Herron on my far right and Felipe Pereda on my closer right. This event is made possible with the support of William Bill Haley, a former corporator of the Worcester Art Museum who established an endowment in 1989 for annual lectures concerning matters of art. By doing so, he wanted to honor his parents, Amelia and Robert H. Haley. The title of this panel, Are We Taught the Wrong Thing About Art?, is rather catchy. It came up as Jock, Felipe, and I were discussing the framework of a panel about Tales of an Epoch, which has the subtitle, The Origins of Art Education in America. Felipe is the editor of Paul Sachs's writings, as well as the author of a substantial introduction that contextualizes the connoisseurial approach to art at the time and the role that Sachs's museum studies program at Harvard had for generations of museum professionals, academics, and collectors. As our world is in flux and the understanding of the museum's role in it, the question of what is the right thing to learn about art is again very much at the forefront. I will give you an example. Museums across the United States are currently revising the canon of what should be shown in the galleries. Female artists are inserted wherever possible into the narrative, as are artists of color. Some of you might have already visited our newly reopened American gallery. If you haven't, I really encourage you to do that. And you will see that it is very, very different from the way American art is traditionally shown. The variety of media, but also it is not just portraits of very important white people, but also portraits of people of color, lots of portraits of women in that same display. So there you have already the stage set for something that is in movement, where the context is as important as the connoisseurial identification of authenticity or of attribution and so on. But first things first. I would like to introduce Jock Herron, co-founder of TidePool Press. Here he is. Of TidePool Press with Inge Jepsen Mark, who was approached by Felipe only a year ago with the question if he was interested in taking the publication on Paul Sachs on. A corporator of the Worcester Art Museum and a former trustee, Jock is a design critic and for the past decade a member of the design engineering faculty at Harvard University, teaching in a program jointly sponsored by the Graduate School of Design and the Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Science. Felipe began his academic career at the Autonomous University of Madrid, where he served as an assistant professor and later as associate professor of art history. He then moved to the United States and joined the Johns Hopkins University as the Nancy H. and Robert E. Hall Professor of the Humanities in the Department of the History of Art from 2011 to 15. In 2015, he was appointed Fernando Zóbel de Ayala Professor of Spanish Art at Harvard University, where he also serves as Director of Graduate Studies. The book that stuck with me was the book on the broken nose of Michelangelo, which is among the many, many books. And you can go to his website at Harvard University and you'll find the list, the impressive list of publications. I will, instead of introducing myself, which is always of bad taste, talk about the connections from a personal view between Paul Sachs and me and the institution that I represent. And there are many, many parallels between the Harvard Art Museums under Sachs and the Worcester Art Museum. Exhibit A are the two courtyards. Ours is later. And we followed the example of the courtyard at Harvard. And I was yesterday there, and ours is at least bigger. So here we go. And then to just give you a highly personal view of the impact in my art historical career of Paul Sax's work. Well, you see him on the far left. Next to him, a gentleman who looks like one of the Three Musketeers. It is Paul Klemen, who was highly revered in spite of his Nazi past at my alma mater, Bonn University. And Paul Klemen gave lectures in the 1920s, is that correct?
Yes.
At Harvard, and he was very much involved in archiving cultural heritage, which then became very important after World War II as some reconstructions were underway. Next to him, you have a certain Mr. Stout, one of the monuments men, and here I'm talking as a cinephile, because he was so beautifully represented by George Clooney. So he also crossed my path as George Clooney. And then on the far left from your side, you see a portrait of Joe Pulitzer Jr. Joe Pulitzer was the late husband of Emily Pulitzer, who got me to America. And Joe was one of the students at the very end of the list, actually, that you published, named. And Joe had an exquisite eye, exquisite taste, and collected of everything the very best. He was trained by Paul Sachs. And just to give you a little anecdote, as you all know, the Nazis came in 1933 to my country of origin and emptied all the museums of what they considered to be degenerate art. And what they thought could be marketable was sent in 1939 to Lucerne, if I'm not mistaken, in Switzerland, and was auctioned off. Joe went with his first wife on their honeymoon to Lucerne to buy at auction. And one of the works that he bought was from the Folkwang Museum in Essen. It is now the Mona Lisa of the St. Louis Art Museum, and it's Bathers with a Turtle by Matthias. So this is the impact of Paul Sachs, who was not just looking at old masters, he was looking at the entire spectrum of artistic production, and he was also looking at contemporary art and shaping the taste and the eyes of his students. So that is how Paul Sachs crossed my path, moi, but it's not about me. It is about it is about the book. It is about Paul Sachs, and so I'm handing the microphone and, even more important,
more important
the
is the clicker.
clicker.
Yes. Great. Thank you very much, Matthias. That's great. So I'm going to give a little context, I think, in terms of the book and also the connections between the FOG and the Worcester Art Museum that go back many generations, in the term of art history, many generations almost, which is wonderful. So Felipe got, I think, contacted us about a little over a year ago and get together, talked about a little bit what it was going to be. And then Ingrid, who I see in the audience as well, and I met with Felipe and talked about it. And it was just this, there's a tight time raise, and that wasn't so clear in the original email, but basically a conference November 9th of just this past fall to celebrate the 150th anniversary of teaching fine arts at Harvard, and Charles Eliot Norton being kind of the key person. And Paul Sachs took one of his courses, interesting, and eventually lived in his house, I think, which is kind of one of the part of the amazing kind of connections here. And the manuscript that Sachs had put together is a fascinating manuscript in its own right, but you can see why it wasn't published over many years, not because it wasn't fun to read, but it really didn't have kind of the substance and meat that it might have. However, that's changed, I think, with the forward that you did, extensive, and also Joseph Kerner did, who was chair of the department, that put it much more in context, and I think brought the book to life and made it a far more interesting book rather than just an artifact. And so that has more currency to it, which I think would be part of the conversation as we go forward. So anyway, this is the uh, uh, cover of the book, of course, over here, designed by Ingrid. And another book came out that the Getty published also about the museum course as people became more fascinated by the influence that it had over time. So the reason I kind of knew a fair amount about the museum course, not as much as I learned later, was actually my Aunt Louisa Dresser, who was the curator of the Worcester Art Museum for many years, acting director during the war, and then returned as curator and then later a trustee. And this is just a sentence that came out of the Smithsonian Archives American Art. But I took a course with Paul Sachs in French painting, which was wonderful. It couldn't have been a better introduction to seeing works of art. And she'd been a Phi Beta Kappa, junior Phi Beta Kappa at Vassar, had never taken an art history course. So Frances Henry Taylor, who she got to know well, insisted maybe she should take this course and arranged it. And she took several others as well. But this one clicked, I think, in particular in terms of how she thought about things. One of the things interesting, she almost never mentioned that she took courses at Harvard. It was always at the Fogg. She was a very proud Vassar graduate and wasn't going to fall into that trap. But in any event, at roughly the age of 26, she was given a remarkable assignment by Taylor to really look at the 17th century American portraiture. A number of them at the Worcester Art Museum itself, but also at other collectors were there as well that had their famous ancestors were there, and they analyzed it. And so she used a lot of the resources of the American Antiquarian Society to look at the documentation, but also was one of the early people to work with the X-ray analysis of paintings that was really championed by Alan Burroughs, who was the conservator, and they're calling it radiographs or something like that, not just X-rays, but to examine what's really going on behind the scenes, what you see, what's the overpainting, et cetera, to really analyze it. And they analyzed a lot of these pictures, discovered a lot of them were actually fake. They were old paintings that had been done largely in England, but overpainted to kind of, how'd you like a new ancestor? But in any event, there was a lot of analysis that went on there very early. And then in the other times, Edmond de Beaumont, who became head conservator, I think we're in the 30s, came to Worcester, but he came to Worcester from the Fogg, where he'd worked with George Stout, who was later director of the Worcester Art Museum, but had been in the Fogg, and then went on to head the Gardner in Boston, and was also took the museum course as well. So there's a heritage in that. There's also a tie, and also Burroughs wrote this book, Art Criticism from a Laboratory, which is giving the sense of multiple ways of looking at a picture. In the year 2000, it's great to see Susan Strickler here because I think you led the way. And so a lot of work was done, but they didn't get they didn't get everything right. And so one of the great paintings that Louisa would really help bring into the museum was the Freak Limner, those two spectacular sort of 17th century portraits that eventually became a stamp for the U.S. postage stamp. But future work, and it's Paul Klassmeyer, I never got through it, did a lot of the work, and then you wrote, Susan, some articles about it. But really, they determined that the baby came later, I think. And that was revealed once the X-rays were done, just to give a sense of how powerful these techniques were. But you didn't get it right. We didn't get quite it right in the mid 30s, but sort of, 2000, all the work was still ongoing. So that kind of way of analyzing and understanding. The freak out, I think, came from an Atlantic article. That was their headline about this. So the Paul Sachs, the museum course, I was familiar with, but I really didn't have a sense of how fully extensive it was. And it was focused on the object. And actually, there were quite a few women involved and participated in it. But the people I put out here that went on to direct museums afterwards, you can see most of them are men. And so the museum culture was different from the academic culture. It wasn't as generous, to put it mildly. But there's Sherman Lee, who went on to become the head of the Cleveland Museum, Perry Rathbone, who fundamentally transformed the MFA, Chick Austin, who was, you can see why he's dressed the way he is, remarkable head of the Wadsworth, Alfred Barr, who'd been eventually teaching at Wellesley, and used to come into Worcester to see modern paintings. James Warmer, head of the Met, the remarkable Agnes Mongan, who was actually with the Fogg. That's an Alexander Calder kind of caricature just to the left of that. And she eventually became director of the Fogg, but it was much later in life. And the main thing was they moved her from being keeper to curator, as I recall, as a remarkable person. John Walker, who became head of the National Gallery, I believe. And then down below, we've got Joseph and Emily Pulitzer, where there's real tie-ins because, of course, Matthias worked closely with Emily Pulitzer out in St. Louis. And also she was one of the lead funders for the Renzo piano and the whole kind of the art museums that have come. And obviously Joseph Pulitzer with that brilliant eye you've already mentioned. And then Lincoln Kirstein, one of the great culture critics of the 50s and 60s. And Edward Warburg, who was a great collector, but also a blood relative of Aby Warburg, who figures very much in the book and all that. So there were a lot of threads that tie things together. So whenever you want to know anything, of course, you have to go to AI. So I chose Gemini here, AI overview. And this is about Paul Sachs, the influential Fogg Museum director, professor, who shaped the Worcester Art Museum. Might be a bit strong there.
Yeah.
Primarily by training its leaders through his famous Harvard Museum Studies course, and identifies key curators at WAM, including Louisa Dresser, Charles Sawyer, George Stout, were Sachs students. So there was a very close connection in terms of the 30s and 40s of the influence that Sachs's museum course had on the art museum. It was interesting in that era, the 30s and 40s, there were maybe 40 or 50 kind of serious art museums that were well established and the like. 40 years later, they're probably closer to 500. I don't know what the number is, but this was training a whole generation of people that went out and really created the museums as we know them more today. And so it's a very important part of that. As far as Worcester is concerned, there's Stephen Salisbury to the left, and he gave his benefaction. It was really for the benefit of all. He wasn't necessarily thinking of a art museum quite as we know it. There were early classes. There were a lot of plaster, sculptures and the like. It was really to educate people. But if you look at the people that figure in this book, Tales of an Epoch, not all of them were in the museum course, but Francis Henry Taylor was very close to Sachs, figures frequently, and he went from Worcester to the Met as director and then came back. George Stout, you've mentioned Daniel Catton Rich, who came from the Chicago Art Institute to Worcester as director. H.W. Jansen, you've probably heard of his art history book, also taught at the time, but he was in the museum course. Charles Sawyer, also one of the monument men. Frank Smith, who was a great benefactor, very close friend of Sachs from college days. And I couldn't resist including Gordon Washburn, who was a great friend of Wheezy's and grew up in Worcester, very much a part of the museum course, who headed the Asia Society, the RISD Museum, and also the Albright Knox. It wasn't called that, I think, at the time in Buffalo. So there's a very kind of intimate connection on the personal basis between a lot of principles in the early part of history here. And a quote I probably overuse sometimes is that Faulkner cliche, the past is never dead. It's not even past. So a lot of this DNA kind of sticks around. Things change a lot, but it's sort of fundamental to it as well. Now, in point of fact, Worcester had already started in a much more adventurous way before Paul Sachs was involved. And so early directors, Philip Gentner, who also figures in the book, and Raymond Henniker Heaton were very involved with, that's where the Gauguin came from early on when under Henniker Heaton. And prior to that, the Mary Cassatt, Mother and Child, was purchased. And so already there was sort of an adventurousness sort of starting in terms of the type of collecting that was being done at the museum, which is important. The famous dial was actually housed at the museum here, so when it was showed in 1924, but also until sadly went off to the Met, that became another piece. So that was very shown in Worcester. So when Alfred Barr would come from Wellesley to show his students modern art, he came to Worcester. MFA didn't have much. Boston collectors had a lot, but the Worcester Museum was a bit ahead of the game in terms of that. So I think that's part of the context here as well. And finally, this stuff can overshoot. And this is a sort of an etching of Georges du Maurier on the connoisseur. And obviously that could become quite specialized. And that's one of the topics I think that you will particularly be talking about, because it raises the question we have, are we taught the wrong things about art? And so our questions about the relationship between the object itself and the context within it's shown. There are questions about art versus the artifact. And you see more decorative arts. Louisa Dresser was originally curator of decorative arts when she was young, because Francis Henry Taylor said nobody will know what that means. But obviously decorative arts change. So how do you integrate furniture and other pieces into showing of art? Do you overshoot, become too historical sometimes, those sorts of things? The difference between an artist and an artisan. What are the differences? What does it mean? And I think very importantly, the curator and the audience. And that sort of begs the question of connoisseurship and Salisbury's original intention of the benefit of all, and how do you do things which the museum did early on in terms of education, classes, and the like for everybody to come in, and how do you bring people up to speed? Do you create this sort of narrow world for the elite who are arbitrating things, or you kind of open things up? There's no real right answer. It's just the kind of tension, and I think that's part of the conversation we're going to have. So. Now you're on your own. I'm just going to sit and listen, but I'm looking forward to this.
I think it's just for you now.
Okay.
I have the question though.
Okay.
Yes.
So I would like to start with a very big picture here. During the life of Paul Sachs and his generation of connoisseurs, you can go to the next one, I think. Here we go. His generation of connoisseurs, the world was in upheaval. In the United States, I learned when I moved to St. Louis that at the beginning of the 20th century, there were racial riots in East St. Louis, and every person of color was evicted. Think about KKK, to give just some American examples. When you're going to the bigger world context, or to Europe rather, it's not bigger, you have the rise of authoritarians. You have World War One. World War II. And among the authoritarians, Mussolini pops up just once in the writings because Paul Sachs is angry that the fascists in Italy were much more national heritage minded and didn't want to let certain artworks go. But that's the only time that Mussolini comes up. Hitler comes up because of his lecture that he gives in Germany, and he encounters the brutality of the Nazis, and the Holocaust starts to evolve. And it is really interesting that the political side never comes up. What is also interesting, in that same time, cultural heritage, beyond the human brutality, cultural heritage is lost at a speed never known before due to the industrialization. And I'm wondering, is there something like an exile from the world, like an inner immigration, or can you place the connoisseur in that context?
Okay, try to answer that question. But I think in order to answer the question, we need a little bit of a zoom back and see who this guy Paul Sachs is. Who certainly he didn't want to be involved in politics, and he certainly did find the arts some sort of a kind of an island in a crazy world in which he was living. But it is also interesting how many ways he couldn't avoid, right, the politics of his time. So Paul Sachs, because of his heritage, who he was and how did he come to Harvard, I think it is important to remember who Paul Sachs is.
Yeah.
So Paul Sachs comes to Harvard 1896 to study humanities. Actually, he doesn't get in. He applies for a second time. He does finally get in. He's the third generation German. Had moved. His grandfather Samuel Sachs had moved from Duisburg, Bavaria, 40 years before. Of course, he's from a Jewish family, and they have moved to first to Baltimore, next to New York. There are actually his grandfather was a little craftsman, but then he opens a small building in the textile. And then immediately after, in this crazy New York of the 1880s, he starts to make money and maybe even try with a little bank with a guy called Goldman. Paul Sachs is the eldest son of the founder of Goldman Sachs. So he goes to Harvard and he does well, although he's not an extraordinary student by any means. After graduation, he's hoping that because he's taken some classes in fine arts, you'll see in the story that, at least for myself, I feel myself very much reflected in the history of Paul Sachs, like someone that could have been something else, but then got under the influence of the arts, and then decided to make a turn in their lives. So it's a similar thing to Paul Sachs. After commencement, he is hoping that his father will let him stay at Harvard and take some more classes in the fine arts, which he's loved. And his father looks at him in the eyes and says, well, you've got to do some job for me first in Wall Street, and then let's see how you do maybe in the future. That was longer than he expected. So he is working at Wall Street for 15 years. And after 15 years in Wall Street, by now he's in his mid 30s. he says, "No, I'm done with Wall Street. This is
He
not what I
does
want
use
to do."
his bonuses to buy pictures, though, well, which is kind of amazing. That's yeah.
And while when he recalls in his memoirs, every day he was just looking for the lunch time that he will be free, so
Yeah.
he'll go, buy
Yeah,
some
yeah.
prints and maybe look at some other artwork with a very good friend, Ivins, who later became the curator of print actually at the Metropolitan, right? So I think that it's an interesting thing, how he's trying to find his way in life, and I think he's very much inspired by the arts. And he comes to Harvard, and the first director of the museum, his name Forbes, says, "Well, why don't you stay with me, right? And we will learn together." And we'll learn together. I think you used previously a sentence or a phrase that I have had in the back of my mind every time when I think of him, which is learning to see. Let's get and learn to see together. And we think of learning to see as something counterintuitive. We all know how to see, right? You get in front of a painting, you just see what it's out there. Well, these people think that you really need a training for the eye. And this is not something that you can learn from books. You have to be exposed to the artworks themselves. You've got to talk in front of the artworks and then see things that the others don't see. And I'm sure it happened to many of you in this room, that you go with a friend who's not interested in the arts, maybe for the first time in a museum, and you notice that you're seeing things that they are going completely overlooked, right? And it is what an immense pleasure is when you show someone enjoy things that otherwise would have been so kind of flat or uninteresting. So I think that he gets into this business of learning to see. He's very much, of course, trying to stay away from politics, building this museum. He will soon become the director, soon also produce a new one. I mean, and because of his experience at Wall Street, he's very good at fundraising, something that it is hard where to learn. So he's made very good friends in the banking world among people like Felix Warburg from the Warburg family, people with whom actually has share some interest, but also some histories. So there are also Jewish families that are bankers now in New York. And they start putting some of the money, but also not only the money. I think they're putting more than that. They're putting the passion, but also the knowledge of how to organize these large institutions, right? So in the 1930s, as the museum is growing and as he's actually also developing what we've called this museum program, that is really developing the field in a very unique way and training so many scholars that we're going to go out to so many museums. That's not been mentioned, but I think these numbers are important. So in between 1921 and 1947, almost 400 students took the class. I think it was something like 388. And Paul Sachs was a very organized man, took note of every single name of these people. 160 of them went into major jobs in museums around the country. So this is a huge influence, right? And for the rest,
in the appendix of all the people. It's
yeah,
really
exactly.
stunning. It's really
He knows
startling.
everyone, right? So this network is really going to shape art history and the museum cultures in ways that it won't be the same thing for the next generations, right? So by the 1930s, because of these things, he's going a lot to Germany. He's been asked to lecture, and some of the greatest art historians of the time, like Aby Warburg, the brother of his good friend Felix Warburg, actually invites him to Hamburg. He's building up this very important institution, the Warburg Library. And he's also exposed to what's going on in Germany. People like Paul Clemens, that Matthias was mentioning before in Bonn. He had been invited in the 1920s to lecture at Harvard. So he goes back when he goes back to Germany in 1933. This is the key moment for the end of the Weimar Republic. He goes to Bonn and actually spends the holidays, the Christmas holidays with him. And he notices that there's kind of this big gap, a political gap being created in between them, because they see reality in a very different way. And these things are not that much in his biography, and that's interesting. You get to see those things, what actually happened in the their correspondence, which is why we include in the book the long introduction that tells you everything that it is not explicitly into his biography, but it is implicit into it. So you go to look into the archive to put together the rest of the fragments to have a full picture. So he tells you that he's in 1933 in Bonn with this old friend of him that had been lectured in his university, and he notices that he's completely a Nazi. He's convinced that Hitler is going to bring a new world, right? So the friendship just comes to an end at the moment. When he comes back to Germany again in 1937 for the last time in his life, and he writes on the train back from Berlin to London a beautiful letter to his wife, and telling him, "This is hell. These people are living in hell," and actually they don't know, which is what's so crazy, right? Goes back, and I think he does see there is something about the museum as kind of a spiritual island, if you will, in this crazy world. But there's also the commitment of the museum as a cultural institution to respond to this, right? To have an answer to this, or be kind of a way for the future. It is, I think, for this is very interesting. So, only, of course, the year after the Guernica episode would happen, northern Spain, and Picasso will made the so important painting that is today in Madrid, but was in the United States for so long, the Guernica, as a memory of the bombing of this little town in the Basque country. And he puts all his effort in order to try to bring the painting to Cambridge. That's not very well known, but the Guernica had traveled a lot throughout his life. It is not only between New York and Madrid. Actually, it make a tournée all around the country. And so what you're seeing on the screen, the letter is just one of the many letters that were written on this occasion between him and his colleagues, finding the interest of bringing the Guernica to Harvard. It was placed in the one of the big halls of the museum between Romanesque capitals, medieval capitals, and there was a wall text that was put right on the side, which read the following. Was written written by one of his colleagues in the department. This picture, painted to arouse indignation and protest, and not to please, is surprising and puzzling to many people. And where this is been put there in 1941. So the United States about to get into the war. They're looking, from abroad, saying this is going really bad. If it may at first even strike you as completely crazy because we are not accustomed to and do not fully understand art venturing into the realm of the psychological and the super real world of the mind, Picasso attempts here to express horror by evoking association from the kaleidoscopic phantasmagoria of images, memories, stored in our minds and in our dreams. Instead of giving a realistic description of an actual air raid, the artist has endeavored to imply the chaos and shock of disaster in psychological terms. These hideous and fragmentary abstractions of the human and animal form, enacting terror and rage in a moonlight nightmare world of the artist's creation, are intended by the very outrageousness of their distortion to disturb and revolt the spectator, to make him feel, by the associations those phantoms arouse, something of the break-up of the mind and spirit that takes place in such a catastrophe as the air raid on Guernica, a catastrophe symbolical of the ruin threatening to overwhelm the whole Western civilization. These figures are bodily drawn, if likeness to real anatomy is our only criterion. They are Picasso's creations, his imagining of a new anatomy calculated by its pitiless caricature of human beauty to suggest the mental and physical disintegration and terror of people dying under the bombs. I think it is a very touching text. And I do think how Paul Sachs, who was behind the display of the painting in the Fog Museum, and this is one of the things he was most proud of his whole career, he speaks about how art itself does have a voice. You have art let speak by itself. So you might say he was not very much interested in politics. Well, I think he was interested in doing politics through the arts themselves. And I think that was a very serious take on what museums can do in order to shape the world in which we're living. I don't know if that answers your question. Well, maybe it was too long.
No, very much, very much. Now I'm zooming in, literally. So when Sachs developed this more comprehensive way of teaching, this happened at the same time as photography became very important for art history teaching. At the same time, a Swiss art historian who taught in Basel, in Munich, and in Berlin, Wölflin, started to teach with 2 slides for comparative viewing. Can you talk about how this photography, this interest in photography, which distorts our viewing actually, because everything is like this available, whereas when you go into a dark church, your eye needs to get accustomed to darkness. The scale changes, and so many other things change. The materiality vanishes. So how does a connoisseur like him navigate this treacherous and yet extremely helpful morass of photography?
Yeah, I think that's a question that it is still timing, right? So we struggle all the time. So how do we approach, or how do I teach my students to see? How do we educate our eyes? And I've been an academic for all my life, and I've never worked at a museum. So for me, most often books have been the resource, right, for that. As you see here, a photograph of the of my department's library when at the time when it was hosted within the building of the museum itself, right? So when the department is growing, so it's very important to understand this, and it is not just, I'm not doing this just about praising the history of my department. It was what we can learn from this example. And what we can learn is that he's immediately aware that if he wants to teach their students art history, they need to read, but they need to see. The first thing that you can use to replacement of the artworks themselves are, of course, photographs and later slides. If you don't have a large collection, which is in the process of making it, so it will happen over time. So he will actually make a big effort in making a collection of slides and photographs as big as possible. Actually, by 1930, they have something like 300,000 slides. Most, it's interesting this, most universities are getting rid of their old collection of slides. And actually, it's been, this is kind of a dramatic. People just throwing them away. They don't know what to do them. There were millions of slides that were used in every department, everywhere in the world. Not only in the United States.
Like card catalogs, in a way, was given up, and then AAS is struggling to keep some of them just as archival records.
Yeah, and I think they're very important and very interesting documents because students very often they were learning art through the slides. This example that I'm giving you is the notes from a student at Harvard in the 1940s, actually Fernando Zóbel, who's the name of my chair. He was an artist that was, I found his notes from class in the archive. Wow. And this is actually El Jaleo from the Gardner Museum. And these are his notes taken in class, making a little sketch of the thing. And this is something that, I mean, maybe some of you have done when being in, in taking a class in whatever, there's something, a visual element. That's what I did always when I was in college. I think they know this is something that is important, that it is useful, but they also immediately realize that there is a fundamental problem with this. As this collection of slides are growing, and this is a famous book by André Malraux that made a claim that actually we're, and this is in 1940s, living increasingly in a world that has no borders, because actually you can have everything in your living room if you have a good collection of books, illustrated books or slides, right? But there's something that you might have noticed, which is it's something very tricky with slides, particularly at this time in history, which is that until very, very late in the mid-20th century, images were black and white. So actually, there's a whole generation of students everywhere in the world which is being trained to look in our art and looking at art and paintings, sculptures, whatever, in black and white, and not noticing that there's something fundamentally wrong about this. You know, artists are not color blinded, nor should art historians be. So as they put together a collection of casts, which is something the only way that you could, bring the great masterworks of the ancient Greece and Rome to the museum, and this is how the entrance to the old fog looked like. You've got to replace. You've got to find a way to bring not color, but maybe the life of art into teaching. Paul Sachs, as I'm describing, is the kind of the soul of this project, was not the originator of it. It was another person called Charles Eliot Norton. And Charles Eliot Norton, who was the person who had founded the department, was a very good friend of John Ruskin, the British painter and critic, theorist, and also draftsman. And John Ruskin, who got the first professorship in the fine arts in Oxford, 1869, was maybe in the same position that I am myself now, speaking to you, this audience. But in 1869, you had no slides, definitely no projector, nothing like it, right? So not even possibility of projecting anything behind you. John Ruskin introduced a method of teaching which is kind of unique, which was to bring his own reproductions to the audience. So he will teach with his own watercolors, reproducing the works of the past. So things like this. This is a watercolor by Ruskin on Venice, or that one is a copy of Veronese. He did this for two things. He did this for the reason that he thought that the visual component was fundamental. There's no way you can teach on the fine arts just with verbal language. There's going to be something intrinsically linguistic. As I was saying before, images have their own way of speaking. But also thinking that by using his own reproductions, and maybe, as he did, training in Oxford his own students in making reproductions of the works of art that we're studying, there's no way that you can better learn an artwork than by copying it yourself. Never would you put so much time and attention in an artwork that by copying it your own. So what Paul Sachs, first Norton and later people like Paul Sachs will be to first have a large collection of drawings, things like this beautiful watercolor that John Ruskin that you're seeing. This is, by the way, Charles Eliot Norton and the first professor of drawing that he brought into the department. So the students will go into the department and take the first year that I was taught a class in the history of art and a class in the history of drawing, in the practice of drawing. So there was a studio component that was from the very beginning. So that students will be both studying and making, and as much as they could, making reproductions with watercolors. We didn't reproduce this in the book, by the way. I came across this when working in the archive. These are drawings made in class by someone that is looking at the artworks, but now not as a marginalia, little thing in the margins, but really part of the exercise that they're being asked to do. And you might notice here maybe the name of the artist, T.S. Eliot. So T.S. Eliot, the poet, actually took a class. And I found they've not been published, which I think is kind of amazing. They're just in the archive, right? He was just learning to draw, right? He was certainly a much better poet than a draftsman, as you can see. So he did the right choice in going into poetry. But that was part of the way, right? So they were really thinking about a way to overcome the limitations of photography. Other things. So, for example, how can you convey the materiality of an artwork, right? So when you have a slide, it is completely flattened. So it's not only doesn't have color, but even in a color photograph, if you're, say, making a photograph of a relief all the texture of the object is being lost, right? So they decided to do nothing less than to put a collection of what they called rubbings. Rubbings mean you go to Egypt and you put a paper on the surface of the relief and you rub it. So what you bring back home is a reproduction, at least, of the tactile quality of the thing, and it's a perfect scale, obviously, and we have lots of this. So what a beautiful training for the eye, but also
Yeah.
for the hands. You think about the sensuality of the experience of the arts. I mean, we're not usually allowed to touch the sculptures in museums. I'm sorry for that. But you certainly are kind of attracted, right, to do it. There's a tactile component to the experience of art. So they did do all these things. But moreover, let me give you one final example. One of the things that happens with photography, again, until late in the 20th century, art was always taught in black and white until color photography is introduced. What happened before that? They were only just looking at black and white photographs. They were not. Some of the most interesting experiments that are done in this lab, unique laboratory for the arts, that it is that of Harvard, is the work of this man, Lyndon Smith. Lyndon Smith this is him. He would go to places like Persepolis in Iraq, to Egypt, or to Angkor in Cambodia, and make his own watercolors on the spot. So he's saying, I know I have photographs, but they're useless. So the works of Lyndon Smith are some of the most, I'm sorry for the quality of these images, but they're truly spectacular. So much so, and that's very interesting. So he was doing these watercolors of these archaeological works from ancient times. Soon after they were discovered, many of these works now have lost all the polychromy that they had when Lyndon Smith did this thing. So the photographs that you can make of this, Amenophes IV, any ancient Egypt works are the colors are completely gone. So you have to look actually to the watercolors. So there's nothing that can replace the eye. That's actually what you learn from this. There's nothing that can replace the eye. So the experience of art is something that technology can help you, but ultimately it is in your eye that everything's happening, in between your eye and your mind. So I think, again, going back, learning to see. These is kind of things that you're learning to see. You see things that otherwise you would have not noticed, right? At the same time, may I give one more anecdote? This brings a strong element of subjectivity into the experience of art, right? So there's something that is very technical, is very thoroughly managed, but at the same time, ultimately, your experience with the work of art actually is just a kind of an individual experience. One of the greatest professors of art history in those years was a medievalist. His name is Kingsley Porter. You see him here, one of the most famous medievalists in history, and one of the most scientific minds that you can think of. Right, he will go all across Europe to put together all this whole history of Romanesque sculpture. While he was doing these things, he wrote a novel that was published in Boston in 1919, and he writes the following. Again, in a novel, right? Doesn't happen in a scholarly book. Scholarship, which seems, so I'm going to read through it. Of all illusions, the most futile and the most dangerous is that of emancipation from illusion. Lucretius was only one of a long series of Don Quixotes who have chivalrously set their lances in rest to reduce to a fact a world whose lungs can only breathe the air of unreality. Scholarship, which seems so cumbersome, so bound hand and foot to the fact, is in reality based on illusion. The student one day conceives intuitively a thesis. He then sets out to collect facts to support his point of view. If he be of altogether exceptional integrity, he may alter his preconceived opinion slightly, never very much, to conform with the result of his researches. Usually, however, his original idea remains inviolate, and is the inspiration which spurs him on to ransack dusty folios and archives to decipher forgotten records. When all is done, the future quickly discards the thesis which has been his pride, to support which he had expended years of patient labor. So in a way, he's saying science is great, but science changes all the time, and in the humanities more than in any other world, right? So every generation looks in a different way, and you cannot resist to that because the aesthetic experience ultimately is subjective. So I think it's fine that he will play with this idea in a novel, but kind of his soul was divided in between the scientist and the art lover. He's trying to bring the two together, but he knows they go sometimes not parallel.
Yeah. So, no, that's really fascinating. The photography is, in a certain way, an archival document. It archives the artwork, and it can help as an aide-mémoire.
Yeah.
Conservators, it can help art historians, and as we established, cannot replace the original. However, during World War II, this was the one of the biggest destructions of cultural heritage, let alone of all the human tragedy that this created. And photography became extremely important to trace artworks, to rebuild cities. There's another connection with Paul Sachs, and it is that of the monuments men.
Yeah.
Who did use photography, who did use all these indexes and all this documentation. Could you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, that's I think a beautiful chapter of his memoirs. Let me go through some of the things I was about to show you. This is the plans for the museum. This is the collection of pigments that they put together in order to analyze these things. I might get to that. So this is the thing that I want to show you. So this is during World War II. So again, going back to my early reflections on Picasso and the Guernica and the connection of art to politics, whether we want it or not. That's the way the world in which we're living. One of the things that he was most proud of is that in 1941, Paul Sachs brought together many museum directors to work on a resolution for what they call the emergency plan for the protection of the works of art. Of course, 1942, about the American troops are going to come into occupied Germany and France, and he's immediately aware to the problem of both the conservation and the preservation of the artworks they're going to be encountering for their protection, but also later on, of course, for the restitution. So he's at the very beginning of this emergency plan that will be developed later in what was called, I'm reading because it's a name that I wouldn't remember otherwise, the American Commission for the Protection and Salvage of Historic Monuments in War Areas. That was 1942. It gets the approval of President Roosevelt, and they decide actually that the army would need actually to have a component of an expertise that will know how to address these issues. So they put together a whole program for knowledge in things like instructing the army on things like, how does gas affect artwork? So what do you do with you when you find something in such a condition like this one, or how actually to develop a procedure for the restitution of things to know to which collections they begin. Interestingly enough, all these photographs come from a book that was published by James Rorimer. James Rorimer was one of the students of the museum course and had become the director of the medieval collection, so the curator of medieval art at the Metropolitan Museum, and will be soon nothing less than the director of the cloisters.
Right.
So James Rorimer actually was sent to France, and he actually wrote a whole book in which he recounts his experiences in between 1942 and 1945. What was he finding, and how his very unique expertise will help actually to preserve these things. So these are some of the beautiful drawings. I mean, I believe that's James Rorimer himself to the left. Things that were coming across, and they need to, again, protect, but also bring back to the right owner. So I think, and here you see a really clear connection in between art history and history with capital H itself in ways that only someone like Paul Sachs could predict its importance.
And George Stout came down before he was at Worcester, but he came from the Fog and he was very involved in that, as was Charlie Sawyer. He was already named director of Worcester Art Museum and he went down. And my mother worked for him and he was part of that. And she refers under sort of the OSS, and she referred to it oh so social. They had a very different work experience, but was this extraordinary group of people that came who were trained, did have that Sachs connection, but also had technical expertise and did an amazing amount of work, both on provenance and all the stuff you've mentioned. But the museum Worcester still had a strong connection to it, interestingly.
In the interest of time, I'm summarizing the last question that we had talked about so that we can talk about how context and connoisseurship sometimes are in conflict. So the last question that we had prepared was about the fact that once a new generation in the 70s and 80s came to Harvard, that the connoisseurial approach was abandoned by many universities. And students of art history had a hard time to be part of the museum world because they had lost the connection with the object. And the question would have been, how does the connoisseurial, where was it continued? And it was mostly continued by the older generation at the museums, and then we skipped one to get younger generations back to the object. However, and that's where the controversy is, the Worcester Art Museum, for instance, had one of those controversies of context versus connoisseurial. We had in our presentation of American colonial portraits, our then curator of American art, Elizabeth Athens, in 2017, added to the existing labels that indicated the involvement with slavery of either the sitter or the artist. It created a gigantic controversy. People were finally talking about Worcester. And what we did wrong, what we did right. And I got even hate mail, which normally as an art historian, we don't matter that much. You don't get. People said that they would stop to be members of the Worcester Art Museum. What were we thinking to talk about slavery? These were icons of American identity. When you read the other texts that were there, they were very connoisseurial. They talked about the lace, for instance, of Mr. and Mrs. Freak, but they didn't talk about any involvement with slavery. It was all about material culture and certain traditions that were continued, but the bigger context lacked. We realized after that it was maybe a bit too strong to have over and over and over and over again these references to slavery, when maybe just one explanation somewhere in the gallery could have done the trick. So that's one example where the context and the connoisseurial clash. I give you another one, which is the Gauguin, exactly. So when I studied, and my field was in the Gauguin area, French symbolism, nobody really talked about the colonial exploitation that all of these artists did. Émile Bernard, on whom I worked, he was in Cairo, had for a song rented a big palace and had some underage girls who serviced him in whichever way. And Gauguin was in that same vein. As opposed to Bernard, he also represented these young women, or one in particular, who was 14, if I'm not mistaken. So today this would be seen as pedophilia and would be persecuted. So how do you negotiate that? And Harvard has done an interesting
Yeah.
job in this. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. How much time we have?
Yeah.
For a short political statement.
So, so we have a similar case in Harvard Museum. So I don't work at the museum. I work in the history of art department. We are just across the street.
Yeah.
So some of these get discussed for both sides. So we have this magnificent Gauguin, and I remember when I showed this to one student recently in a class, almost refused completely to look at it, saying, the history behind this painting, I don't want to know anything about Gauguin. So, and there was a time in which recently our museum was facing this same kind of a problem, right? This painting that you're looking at, Poème Barbare, actually does depict this woman, like a very young teenager whom Gauguin married, got pregnant, and then left back, went to Paris, just forgetting about his past and going back with his wife. So it's something really outrageous about this thing, right? I don't think that you cannot anymore ignore the background of the history. Also because it does explain many of the reasons why Gauguin would go to Tahiti. He was both looking for the spiritual wilderness, but also from the darkest side of this wilderness that he was trying to escape from the world, the Western world in which he was living. I think the solution that the Harvard Museums has come with is just to put a very long text on the side, which is the one that you are seeing. So I was in the museum the day before yesterday thinking about if Matthias gets to ask me about this thing, what I'm going to say.
Yeah.
So I would just, so I came and and I noticed that actually it was very interesting because he stayed there in the room for a few minutes, and I did see that most of the visitors actually just look at the painting and completely ignore the text. The text is, as you can see, not short. It tells the full story in a very descriptive way. But there was this student that actually stayed and spent as much time looking at the text as to the painting, and then went back to the painting. So first looked at the painting, thought, what an interesting thing. And then he read the full text, and then went back to the painting. I think she will now look at the painting in a very different way. And I think I don't think it is a perfect solution because there's not a perfect solution for an imperfect world. But at least the museum is now committed to the educational purpose of what they're showing. And I think we have to be imaginative, maybe, in ways that we don't just conceal or repress any of the one of the things, because the aesthetic and the political, whether we like it or not, they're live in the same world together. So in this case, I would praise my museum for what they've done, and I think that, but this is not the only way to do it. I think there are many other ways in which this could be done, but we cannot ignore that reality anymore.
And this is, when you think about what happened at Paul Saxe's time, to the initial question, the world was in upheaval, authoritarians were rising everywhere. We have exactly the same moment right now. And we, in that bigger context, museums have to ask themselves, for whom are we? What is the message that we are conveying? Is it just the connoisseurial, which is our bread and butter? Or is it more than just that? And as you say, in an imperfect world, there are no perfect solutions, but we are looking in a much more comprehensive way. And you will see this again when you, should you have the time to go to our American galleries, how they are speaking about American art in a much more comprehensive way than what was traditionally done. We have a little bit of time should you have the stamina to ask questions, and then Jock, on the basis of your input, will press a button and come up with a summary of
and I'll
the whole
disappear.
day.
No.
I want to go back to the comment you made about black and white
Mhm.
and photographs. Of course, no artist until the third quarter of the 20th century started their art without just a charcoal. and all drawing was black and white. So the thought of taking color away from all artwork, and I would recommend taking names away from all artwork in order to analyze them, would be a good thing. But you mentioned Joseph Linden Smith,
Yes.
and in that way, he took sculpture. We had ancient sculpture, and for centuries, ancient sculpture was looked at in its white form.
Hmm.
But Linden Smith did the first exhibition around 1905, recoloring all the sculpture.
Absolutely.
Right. So would you recommend that all sculpture be looked at again with its color in order to fully appreciate what it was meant to be?
Well, there's a big debate right now in ancient art specialists about what to do with Greek art. Should we bring back their color? And there's actually some important German scholarship on these things, and there've been many books now being published in which they repaint everything in the photograph, which for our taste looks just awful. It is so hard to look at it, right? You imagine the Parthenon in blue and white and green. I mean, there's no way with our eyes being trained so much, just conceive and imagine these things as perfect white, right? But I think, and it's interesting what you're saying. So it is true. Lyndon Smith actually was the first person ever to publish a book on the color of Greek sculpture, and it's never rarely mentioned that, which I have to say that I'm a little bit upset by. Well, I don't, I cannot imagine museums doing like repainting anything, but I think that there's ways in which you could, maybe with text, maybe with reproductions on the sides that will help your imagination work and try to travel in time, I would say. Yes.
It's also an issue in architectural preservation, because you look and they do a lot more work in terms of all the layers of paint, and it isn't all classic white houses and little villages. There was whatever was cheaper would last, and so it's a whole broader issue, as you were saying.
I saw at the Wood Museum recently where they projected color onto their Assyrian wall carvings.
Oh, really?
It's quite well done.
Uh-huh.
Talk about it.
Okay. All right. I haven't seen at the body. Okay. Projecting. Okay. That's fine. In the Harvard Museum a few years ago, they did that with not with sculpture, but actually with a Rothko painting that had faded away their colors. So they projected in order to recover the original colors. I think that I think we're gonna get used to more of those experiments, which I think they're great. Yeah.
So thank you very much. I had a quick question. As a question is more has been a historic relation between benefactors and art in history. Started with famous Medici's, culminated with in America, and it seems lately in the last 50 years things have changed. Do you know why it has changed from a point of view of benefactors, supporters of art? We hear people giving millions to AIDS
Okay.
in Africa, but we don't hear Museum of Worcester or something like that.
I would like Matthias to follow on this, but I have something that I want to say on this. So whenever I go to the museum, I take my students, I always tell them, read the text and see who gave this artwork to the museum.
Yeah.
And so often, maybe 80% of the time, you will find a former student that graduated, went into business, made a lot of money, and gave back something of what he took from Harvard to the museum so that we could always, all of us, enjoy it. And I think that makes such a beautiful circle, right? And I think you're right that some of the things is going away, right? I think that was part of the way in which many of these museums have been built, part of the generosity. And I don't know if that it is in a certain moment of crisis. That's maybe more for you to answer.
Yes, and maybe even more for our director of philanthropy at the Worcester Art Museum, Marilyn Early, to answer. So I can only speculate. There is a demographic shift. I think it's there's a demographic shift, and the old elites are shifting as well. And there's a lot of new money, but not those who are in this new money business. .com, they rarely show excessive philanthropy, to put it mildly, be it for culture or for social causes. So there is a shift, but I don't give up the hope that in the long run things will rebalance. But we are in a world of change.
Yeah.
we are absolutely in a world of change. A last question? Yes.
I get the last question. Oh boy. When I was in the American Gallery, and looking at the painting, the view of Worcester from Denny Hill, Denny Hill. Anyway, I think the context is important when you're looking at that Gauguin to know that that's his 14-year-old
Yeah.
wife when he already had a wife back in France, and that he had a child with her. I think that's important. But looking at that painting, Worcester from Denny Hill, at the end of the text, it mentions the Nipmuc Indians that were dispossessed for that land. And I'm just thinking to myself, how did that add to my experience of this painting to know that? Whereas in the Gauguin case, it would be important to know that that was his 14-year-old wife.
Can I
No,
answer
you
that?
have to.
Yeah.
Unless Karen, you want to say something? You want me to say first? And maybe not say anything? It's your choice. I have very strong opinions about that. Firstly, when you are talking, so the way I have to take 5 steps back. Museums, the public, the civic museum, is a child of enlightenment when nation states started to form. And it is at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, that national schools were shown in museums. And when you look nowadays, you always see French-born but American or something like this, to the extent that we don't do this in Europe. But what I want to say with this is that in the same way that the German school in German museums is important to show the soul and the pride of Germans, the American school has that same role to play. So it is already political, and nation states come along with democracy and the attempt to build a kind of shared identity where before there was none in Europe. And in America, it looks very different because it's a country of immigration, and it was a melting pot for some, but not for everyone. I think to only look aesthetically at something that is in a national school is not seeing everything, if that makes sense. You're not nodding yet, so I may not have reached you. I mean, every nation is born out of pain and out of injustices. It's in Europe, it happened much later, and then the injustices were exported to the colonies, whereas here a lot of things happened in the 19th and 20th century. But when you're talking about your national identity in a museum, you have to show all aspects. Otherwise, it's only half of the story. It's not just aesthetics. Aesthetics is the appearance, but it is not the entirety. Have I reached you now? Maybe. Okay, but that's what I have to say. Karen, do you want to add something, or don't feel obliged, but as we have you.
I'm Karen Sherry. I'm the curator of American art here at WAM, so I can speak to the interpretive labels in the American galleries. And I would say that with that painting, which shows a kind of celebratory image of the development of this region, the development of white colonial settlement, what that painting erases is the flip side of that development, which is the violence and the decimation of the indigenous populations. And throughout the history of American art, some artists have erased that history, others have engaged with it. I think as art audiences today, it kind of behooves us to think about those contexts, to think about those histories, and to think about the choices artists are making in representing that history. So that kind of motivated me to acknowledge the indigenous history of this region that is erased in that painting.
And everything is political. I mean, if you think about a Bierstadt landscape or Ansel Adams, whilst nature was trashed due to the industrialization, if you just say it's beautiful and it's American, but you don't say, well, at the same time, this and that happened, which is an information that makes you look differently at that painting. And if it is a meeting where somebody's identity was erased, you look at it differently. So that's just how to say, a statement in favor of a broader context, which shouldn't exclude the connoisseurial and shouldn't exclude the beauty of an Ansel Adams. But once I know that, in the case of Ansel Adams, nature becomes even more precious.
Great. I don't think they're tight ribbons that can be put around a conversation like this. And I think that's what makes it so appealing. And I think that when Ingrid and I met with you sort of a year ago, April or March, it's been a great experience. And part of it selfishly is how it connects to the Worcester Art Museum, but also how it connects to these broad, sort of unanswerable, fascinating questions that are really so fundamental to it. On the label front, I remember reading years ago that somebody watching not close friends of mine, Jackie Kennedy and Henry Kissinger, walking through a museum in New York. Kissinger would read all the labels and not look at the pictures. She never looked at a label, only looked at the picture. So I think the idea you have of people looking at the picture first and then going to the label is not a bad idea. So I think what's fascinating in many ways is that when you think of how you label things, my dad was an architect and he would get up and what's modern architecture versus contemporary architecture, and then this kind of crazy postmodern things. These labels just get at the kind of social construct of information, and they change over time. And I think that's one of the things that make this so interesting. So from a curatorial standpoint and how collections are shifted over time, and it's just what makes this so powerful. And I guess conclude with what will sound like a parochial, but I don't think it's parochial at all, is that the Worcester Art Museum has played way above its weight for many, many years and continues to, in terms of reinterpreting galleries, in terms of what we collect and the like, and the importance to the community. But it's retained always the benefit for all, which is part of the original goal that Stephen Salisbury had, was basically, making art accessible. And so early on, the School of Education coming in, public schools going in, I guess now it's the 4th grade, it was the 5th grade, to go and see pictures is really a fundamental part of what the Worcester Art Museum has done, but it also operates on a very sophisticated level in terms, I know you've come to the Art Museum at various points, as an art historian to see things. And now with your kids see the armor. But anyway, that's a whole different thing. But I think it's something that we should remember, that the stature of the museum is really extraordinarily impressive. And we're very fortunate to have it. It's great. Obviously, philanthropy has played been in the 30s, being in a manufacturing city that didn't go under with the Depression, made Antioch Hospital, all these other things. But there has been this connoisseurship that's continued over really the life of directors and curators that are still alive and well. And it's a dynamic thing that doesn't have closed answers that you just say, here's what we're fixed for the next 20 years. It goes on and on. I think this conversation reflected it. And I think the Art Museum, it's all the vitality of all of this stuff is ongoing. And I think it's been a pleasure. It's been so much fun to work together. And Matthias talked with you about this, but I think it's a great institution, a wonderful institution it changes, it evolves as culture changes. And that's where you're kind of a pinpoint on that. So thank you both very much.
Thank
It's
you,
great.
Jock, and
Thank
thank
you.
you, Matthias.